Bicycle, bicycle, bicycle.
I want to ride my
bicycle, bicycle, bicycle.
I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride my bike. I want to ride my bicycle. I want to ride it where I like.
Advances in technology are undoubtedly one of the key ways that societal change is implemented. The bicycle and its impact on women's rights movement is an example of how the perspectives of marginalized members can dramatically change due to new access to transportation. And so, the bicycle all began with Baron von Drais. In 1817, Carl Drais invented what was called the running machine, which required the use of legs pushing off the ground to propel forwards. Pedals were not introduced until the 1860s. The 1870s brought along the first machine to be called a bicycle, the penny farther. These consisted of an oversized front wheel and a comically small back wheel. The penny farther was popular among men of means who could afford the average price of 6 months' worth of work. By the 1890s, society was obsessed with the bicycle. There were millions of bikes on the roads and a new culture built around the technology. A cycling craze and the women's rights movement of the 90s became so intertwined that it led to revolutionary changes. Susan B. Anthony, an American social reformer and a women's rights activist, even argued that cycling had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. The original bicycles, penny farthers, were notoriously unsafe due to their center of balance being easy to disrupt if anything got into the path of the rider. These bikes were also impossible for women to ride in Victorian fashion clothing, which consisted of large hoop skirts with multiple layers underneath. In 1885, John Kemp Starling invented the Rover safety bike, a much closer representation of today's bicycle. These bikes were much easier and safer to ride, yet still difficult to ride in women's clothing. Thus, the push for rational women's clothing began, moving away from the impractical wear of uncomfortable, restricted dresses of the era.
Such clothing was obstructive to even modest forms of exercise, and as cycling required a more practical form of clothing, large blowing skirts and corsets gave way to bloomers, baggy cotton pants that were popular back in the 1850s. The dress reform was not a simple matter of practical adaptation. It invoked and challenged popular perceptions of femininity and became a hotly contested moral issue as most men considered it immoral for women to be wearing bloomers. Eventually, the battle over dress reform, largely affected by cycling attire requirements, forever altered public perceptions of females. Once hidden under yards of fabric, women cyclists shed their old clothes and quite literally emerged as the new women. To men, as noted in Wheels of Change, the bicycle in the beginning was merely a new toy. To women, it was a steed on which they rode into a new world. It provided a way for women to leave the home sphere and introduced them to many possible career opportunities. By eschewing the traditional roles of wife and mother, women became increasingly politically active in the women's suffrage movement. Thus, in 1890, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed. They lobbied state to state for women's right to vote, eventually becoming victorious, as the United States' 19th Amendment granted women to right the vote in 1920. The Columbia newspaper wrote that women are writing to a greater freedom, to a nearer equality with men, to the habit of taking care of herself. An article in the San Francisco Call noted, "What the interested public wishes to know is there a grand rendezvous somewhere towards which they are all headed, and where they will sometime hold a meet that will cause this wobbly old world to wake up and readjust itself?" It later became evident that the San Francisco Call was right, and the bicycle evolved women's lives in many ways as women were riding to suffrage on the bicycle at the turn of the century.
With such power and independence being adopted by the women of the 90s, most men were unhappy with such drastic social change. Some critics warned that the bicycle was harmful to a woman's health, and all kinds of arguments were thrown up to try and discourage women from taking the wheel. The fragility and sensitivity of the female body were common themes. Concerns such as bike stimulating sexual arousal were argued. Others also warned society of the health issues cycling could possibly lead to for women. They were also informed that bicycle face, the tense expression of concentration required for cycling, would result in pale skin and ruin a woman's beauty. However, such claims were made to discourage women from bicycles rather than actual concerns about women's health. Believe it or not, the bicycle continues to empower women across the globe. It is still viewed as a symbol of women's emancipation. Pedaling to Freedom is a documentary about the year-long initiative that took place in one of the poorest districts in Tamil Nadu, India. The initiative sought to teach the members of the community to read and write, and women in the community were also taught to ride a bike. This allowed for increased mobility and the opportunity for women's employment. Subsequently, the economy was increased and wages were boosted. In Afghanistan, women riding bicycles is still a deep-rooted taboo and is seen as provocative and immoral. Mountains to Mountains is an organization founded by Shannon Galfin. meant to empower women and girls in Afghanistan through bike riding. The impact of bicycles has paved the way to introduce women's rights as a mainstream movement. Although the technology was initially meant for male use, bicycles ended up being enjoyed by all as a way to get around and, more importantly, become free of binding social constructs pertaining to the role of women. Understanding the historical purpose of the bike, the cultural changes inspired, and the responses from both women and men may lead us to construct futures where technology serves to raise up the oppressed and undermined of the world.
How could I forget to mention the bicycle is a good invention? Sitting there in a silent movie beside the only girl who really ever knew me. Happy days but sad of face, and heaven knows I'm on the case. So how could I forget to mention the bicycle?